So if I was to say to you, cataphyll, do you know what I'm talking about? Do you understand how cataphylls work? If either one of those questions is answered by no, then this might be a video for you. So stick around with me and let's dive into the wonderful world of cataphylls. Hi, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So today's video is actually a recommendation by one of you lovely viewers who reached out and said, you know what, if you're looking to do a topic for a video, maybe touch on the point of cataphylls, kind of what they are, what their purpose is, things to look out for, because it was frustrating that individual. Potentially me thinking it might also be frustrating to some other people as well. So the topic for this video came to pass. Obviously, before I dive into anything else, I did want to say a massive thank you to everybody for their well wishes. Whilst I thought I had a cold / flu, actually had COVID. Yay. All feeling much better at the moment, which is really good. I just was wiped out that weekend. Quite glad I filmed when I filmed, because fast forward a few days, I was in bed with a temperature, so worked well. But anyway, back to the topic of cataphylls. So first off, let me give you an example. We'll see different examples of what cataphylls can look like in several different houseplants or several different types of houseplants as well. So one cataphyll that I want to show you is, can you see that new leaf emerging? That has got a cataphyll surrounding it as it's emerging. So a cataphyll in its most basic form is something that is covering a new or emerging leaf at that life stage. A cataphyll will transition into different things as that leaf matures and as that leaf grows out, but we'll touch on that in just a moment. But essentially that is what a cataphyll is. It's that protective sheath, usually around new and emerging leaves. So in this video, I want to touch on the following few topics. One, what is a cataphyll? And we'll look at it in a bit more detail. What their role is in more detail in terms of what they do for certain plants. What these cataphyls might look like in different plants, and kind of how to care for cataphylls. You wouldn't be going out of your way to specifically care for a cataphyll, but there are certain things that you need to be aware of when caring for plants when they have got cataphylls active. So let's look into a bit more detail as to what a cataphyll is. Let me show you another example of a cataphyll, and hopefully that might come out quite nicely. You can see the new leaf there. You might even be able to see the separation between the cataphyll that is surrounding it, that goes all the way up to about here, and that's a new leaf peeking through. A different stage of a cataphyll you should be able to see here, which the leaf, the new emerging leaf, is fully within the cataphyll. And by the way, I will add the name of that plant at the very top for the people that are probably thinking, it's a lovely thing that you showed us a cataphyll. What plant was that? So I'll put it up there. It's had a bit of a kind of glow up-ish and a moss pole since the last time most of you have seen it. But in essence, a cataphyll is a small protecting leaf. If I'm not mistaken, it's still technically a type of leaf that is there to protect, as we were talking about that new emerging leaf. The example that I just showed you, you could see the new growth coming through that cataphyll, and that cataphyll was kind of wrapped around it. So think of it a bit like protective armor for that leaf. If you think about where these tropical plants are growing naturally in kind of forests and tropical jungles, there are a lot of things that could potentially damage that specific growth point. And as you can imagine, a growth point like that on a tree, I was going to say tree, but I mean, some of these plants can turn into trees. But for some of these plants, it takes a lot of energy for that plant to be pushing out that new growth at the very top. And it wants to do everything in its power to protect that from the elements. It could be strong winds that might be bashing the plant around. It might be herbivores that might be coming around. It could even be things like insect type pests, because if the cataphyll is there, you might see this sometimes when you get a whole host of bugs on the outside of a cataphyll, that's kind of doing what it needs to do at that point, because it's protecting that emerging growth point, either from the herbivores, the kind of wind that might be bashing it around, all of these things. It's doing the right thing. So imagine, I'm trying to think of a good kind of example. So think of it as a bit of a cocoon around like maybe an emerging butterfly. The cocoon is there to protect that caterpillar, in this case the new leaf, before it emerges out in the world, because it is very, very sensitive and very fragile in those kind of early stages. So it is there to keep the rest of the big bad world out from that new growing point. Now, one of its functions is obviously to facilitate it kind of being pushed out as well. And this is where things get interesting, and I will bring you an example of a plant where the cataphyll looks a bit different, and it is one that causes a lot of people a lot of stress. Before I show you the plant, 3 guesses, or 1 guess, put it down below. What do you think I'm going to be showing you? Just out of curiosity, when I'm talking about cataphyls failing to do what they need to do in a specific houseplant. Probably to nobody's surprise if they've ever owned a pink princess. But the pink princess is an interesting one, and I can actually show you an example there of how sometimes it will grow out. So sometimes, I find, at least in my experience with pink princesses, you'll get a cataphyll that is part of the previous leaf, and it's kind of within that sheath there, and then it will emerge. And this is the one that's usually problematic, because you usually get like a really kind of mangled looking, very fresh new leaf because it's stuck and it's not coming out. I'll touch on that in just a moment. And the next immediate leaf will be a more traditional cataphyll like what we were seeing before, which was that growthy spike that is within this epipremnum skeleton key propagation, something like this, which generally speaking, if you've ever had something like a pink princess, you would have noticed that when it's that type of a cataphyll, it will come out and generally it will be okay. But when it's this type of cataphyll, which is attaching to the leaf, it tends to be a bit more problematic. Now, let's talk about people trying to yank these out. A lot of the times, I almost want to say 10 times out of 10, when you're trying to pull this out and using brute force, you will just end up with a snapped new growth point before it even has a chance to come out. And almost invariably, if it's something like a pink princess, which takes a while and you might not have that much variegation, I can guarantee you the one that you're trying to pull out and the one that you're really stressing about getting out, 9 times out of 10 is going to be the one that's finally got some variegation and has finally got some of that pink coming through, and you just end up with it on your hand. So say it with me, leave it alone. If it's still stuck a month later, then you can experiment and see what's going to happen, because potentially that leaf is truly stuck and it won't ever mature to anything else, and at that point you might as well try. But if it's just starting to emerge, leave it alone. Bump up the humidity if you can, that will help, but leave it alone. Let's dive into the life cycle kind of a thing of a cataphyll. First one would be this stage here, which I've obviously shown you just a second ago, which is very, very new and very, very green, and it's still very much protecting the leaf. The next one, I cannot, the plant is too big to show you an example, but I will put you one here where the leaf has emerged and the cataphyll is on the side, and it is kind of looking like almost, it looks a bit more like a leaf at that point because it's still green. It looks like something, if you're just maybe starting off on your journey with houseplants, you'd be like, oh, what's wrong with this leaf? It's not a leaf, it's a cataphyll, so it's fine. It's supposed to look like that. But it looks kind of green, and the rest of the growing point has emerged. So that's that kind of intermediate stage. And then usually the final stage of most cataphyls, and I'm trying to see if I can find one in my space to show you, we usually end up becoming something like a dried up husk. Now, let me show you something on this very, very mushy looking cataphyll. And apologies, trigger warning, this is going to be looking a bit mush and a bit pesty. But you might be able to see some pests on that. We will come back to that in just a second in this video. There's a dried up cataphyll there. I know, like, I'm showing you really weird things in this video, but like, I'm trying to display the stages. That's a fully dry one, unlike the mushy one that we just saw now with the pests on it. But one of the things you might be questioning is, why do they crisp up? Why, if it looks a bit like a leaf and it could still be a bit green, like the image that I'm showing you here, why does the plant basically dry them out in favor for the actual leaf and the actual growing point? It's usually just a simple case of resources. Why would a plant continue to give the energy that is needed for the green version of a cataphyll? It has served its role. What it will then do is let this dry off. Any of the nutrients that within that cataphyll will get re-sucked up into the main stem of the plant, as far as I understand it, and then get redistributed, because it doesn't need the cataphyll. The cataphyll has done its job and it now needs to kind of move along and redistributing some of that energy towards the growing tip of the plant, towards the growing leaf of the plant, because that is what the plant needs to do. It needs to continue growing. It doesn't need to be sustaining cataphyls, because yes, it could potentially photosynthesize if it's a green cataphyll, but it's not going to be anywhere near as efficient. So if you're looking at a cataphyll that's like that, but then maybe the leaf that it came out of might have been something as large as this Merildens behind me here, this is going to photosynthesize a lot more than a cataphyll that was this size. So the plant is just like, nope, nope, need to protect this, do not need this, this can dry off and die back basically. But let's have a look at some common types of houseplant that have got cataphylls. By and large, and it's not always exclusive to aroids, but by and large, most of the aroids that we're used to seeing in our houses, in our collections, are the ones that are going to have the cataphylls. And by that, I mean your philodendrons, your monsteras, your anthuriums. Most of these plants will have some form of a cataphyll. So let me give you some examples from each one so you can kind of see. I'll bring up the example again of, and the variety as well of the cataphylls. So that obviously being the pink princess, it can have this type of a cataphyll. Then we've got something like an epipremnum that we were looking at a moment ago that can have this type of a cataphyll. This is a slightly frustrating time of the year for me to be showing you cataphylls, because cataphylls generally mean plants are in active growth, and being that we're coming up to winter, most things are not necessarily in active growth. So I'm going to have to rummage around my collection to see things that are actively growing. But let me show you the philodendron again that we were looking at, because that's got a slightly different type of cataphyll. So the Pinnatillobum affinity, you can kind of see this is the kind of cataphyll that I was talking about, is the second type of cataphyll that you will get on a pink princess, which is generally, in my experience, the one that tends to do a lot better. And you can kind of see it here, as I said before, in its earlier stage there. But, and you can kind of see, this is a philodendron and this is a philodendron. Both of them look different, but they can also have different types of cataphylls. It just depends on the structure of the plant that is usually adapted to its specific natural habitat. So I know, as far as I'm aware, I don't think the pink princess is naturally occurring as a variegation. I don't think. So assuming for a moment that I'm right and this is some form of hybrid, some form of human-made hybrid of a different, and I think this is an erubescens, so whether or not it would naturally mutate into this form, or it doesn't and there's been a lot of human interaction to make it, which I would assume is probably the case with this one, then that's slightly different. But most other plants, so if you're looking at different types of philodendrons and they've got different types of cataphylls, so actually let me show you a dried up cataphyll from the previous growth on this plant, is that little section here, which you can kind of see this kind of paper and it's coming off. But it's to do with their environment. So they've got specific types of cataphylls in order to best deal with their environment when they would grow naturally, their natural habitat. So for instance, what you were seeing on the pink princess when it's growing a cataphyll on an actual petiole of a plant, so the petiole is what attaches to the main stem and to the leaf, so that's what attaches both of them. That might have been something that maybe the erubescens philodendron, the parent philodendron of this one, needed in order to survive in its natural habitat, whilst potentially this Pinnatillobum affinity doesn't need it in its natural habitat, so it goes for the more traditional type of cataphyll that we're used to seeing on a lot more types of plants. Let me show you an anthurium type of Cataphyll now as well. This is the Luxuriance crossed with the Magnificum, so obviously there is a brand new leaf. How cool is that? How cool is that? That's amazing. Oh, get very excited when I get new leaves on anthuriums, especially the ones that grow slowly. But you might be able to see this, in this case, that is a dried up Cataphyll. This is one that has already been spent when it was protecting something else. And there is already another Cataphyll that is protecting that newer growth point there as well. So they can appear in different ways in different plants, even within the same genus of plants, different species will potentially still have Cataphylls, but the way that they look is going to be different. So let's talk about signs of healthy versus unhealthy Cataphylls. So a healthy Cataphyll, and again I'm bringing up the epipremnum, is this type of Cataphyll. So it's still green, it's still attached around the actual emerging leaf. Even the Cataphylls that are still green and attached to the plant but no longer attached to the new emerging leaf, that's normal. Even the drying up of a Cataphyll, that is normal. So all of those life stages that we just talked about earlier on, that is normal, healthy kind of behavior that you should expect to see in Cataphylls. What is unhealthy is the Cataphyll that I was showing you before, and I think I've put it in the bin. Give me a sec. So this, I know it's disgusting again, and I'm sorry that I'm showing it again, that is an unhealthy Cataphyll. So this was green at some point, but pests and mush. Mush isn't necessarily always a problem. It could be an indicator that you are overwatering things or things are staying wet for too long. It doesn't always necessarily cause a problem if it's only on the Cataphyll and not on the growing tip. If you're getting mushing on the Cataphyll as well as the growing tip, that signifies a much deeper problem, potentially down below in your roots or even in the stem of the plant. You might have rot that's progressed quite far if it's gone all the way from the roots to the tip. It could have also been going from the tip down to the roots as well. So it depends if you've got water sitting on it, which is another reason why I said leave the Cataphylls alone. Please leave them alone. Because a lot of people might say, you know what, use some water, spray some water. That's all fine and dandy and it can work, but. And you might be able to get it out. However, if you can't and everything's sapping wet and the Cataphyll is very tightly kind of attached to that new growing point, but water still manages to get through and potentially rot might occur because it's an anaerobic situation, you are potentially introducing a point of rot within that plant that wouldn't have existed if you hadn't intervened. So say it with me, leave it alone. Now I had to put it down, I had to put the mushy Cataphyll down because let's talk about the care that you can give to a plant when it's got Cataphylls, which generally will be most of these types of plants if they're in active growth, if they're actively pushing out a new leaf. First thing, obviously, broken record, leave it alone, but do monitor it. Do kind of have a see and see that it's still protecting the leaf. Good, it's at that life stage, nothing's happening, and if it's still green but detached from the leaf, but the new growing leaf is emerging, that's good as well, and if it's drying off, that's fine. What you might want to do with the dried up Cataphylls, because as they're drying, they still have some moisture in them, and they're usually potentially still very closely attached to that new growing point. Anybody that's had plants for any particular length of time and has had pests knows that this is a problem, because before it goes fully dry and comes off, this, usually in the kind of nook where it's still attaching to the growth point or potentially the growing stem, is where most pests like to go and live. They've got their jam in there, it's got little tight little nooks and crannies that they can go in, and you might not be seeing it because you're generally looking at the rest of the plant, you're looking at the leaves, you're not looking at what you know is about to dry out and drop off, but that might be what's harboring some of your pests. So check, check, check. That's why I showed you the mushy one, because even though it was mushy, the plant is fine by the way, and so is a new leaf, but even though it was mushy, it was covered in mealybugs. And that is a point where those mealybugs are exceptionally close. If you'd imagine that Cataphyll is very close to that new growing point, especially with our slower growing anthuriums, or any slow growing houseplant that has cataphylls. The last thing you want to do is you've been waiting for months for that new lovely leaf to emerge, and then right next to when it's emerging is where you've got pests. So check, 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 and make sure that you are removing those pests. Also, if a cataphyll has served its role, even if it's not fully dry yet, you are completely fine to remove it as long as it's still no longer attached to that new growth point, that new leaf. But overall, if you're seeing a cataphyll on your plants, the comment that I was making before about the fact that this isn't necessarily the growing season for most of these plants, the moment that I am seeing kind of active cataphylls, this one obviously is different, but the moment that I'm seeing the active type of cataphyll, like the anthurium that I showed you, like this epipremnum, to me it's showing that, this plant is still growing. Even though it's not the growing season, that's a good indicator to me that something positive potentially is happening with that plant, and especially in the winter if you're pulling back on watering, pulling back on fertilizing, if you're seeing that active growth, and that might be your first indicator of active growth, it's a good thing. It heralds something that's positive. But obviously keep an eye out for some of those issues that I was talking about earlier on. So let's do some final thoughts on this. So by and large, cataphylls are a positive thing. You want your plant to have a cataphyll because, as I just said, it is an active growth. It is also protecting the plant. So it's protecting it from knocks, bumps, potentially pests, potentially pets. I mean, in a household condition, there isn't going to be herbivores, but there might be a cat or a dog or any other form of pet that could potentially be causing damage. Granted, anybody that's owned a cat or a dog or any other form of pet that likes to munch on things, the cataphyll might not do the mostest. But, you know, it's trying. You might be able to salvage some part of that leaf if some of these pets have been munching on it because of the cataphyll. Because if it was fully exposed to those clamping jaws, you'd be saying, oh no, the leaf is gone. But yes, so it's doing a good job. Remember the life stages that I was talking about, the fully enclosed, the part where it kind of detaches from the leaf because that leaf is finally kind of getting ready to open up, or it's already opening up. And then that drying out, dying phase of a cataphyll. These are important stages to be keeping an eye on. Keep an eye on making sure that there's not that much moisture around it, because you might be introducing rot at an early stage and from above rather than from below, which is something that not a lot of people talk about, but it can happen. You can introduce rot from the top down. So bear that in mind. There's a reason why a lot of plants, potentially some of your Phalaenopsis orchids, they always say, you know what, if you're going to get water stuck in between the leaves and the growing point, and there's usually like kind of ditches and it can pool there and stay there, try to kind of tip that out because it could cause crown rot. See, new words, crown rot and everything. But all of these things are important, and there is a very significant role that cataphylls play. Can they be annoying? Yes. Should you pick at them? No. Should you monitor them? Yes. So cataphylls serve a valid purpose, and they're a good indicator, as I just mentioned earlier on, of good things happening. So potentially your plant growing even in the off-season. But yeah, hopefully this has been interesting for some people. I know some people kind of recognize cataphylls. They'll recognize the kind of dried up cataphylls more. I don't know if everybody always notices them at the earlier stages. I think they are exceptionally interesting adaptations that all of these plants have in order to give themselves the best kind of rate of survival when it comes to their new and emerging leaves and growth points. But yes, hopefully you found this entertaining. Let me know all of your cataphyll horror stories down below, because I'm sure everybody's got some of them that they would like to share. And I think it's nice because if you all share it down below, it might make people that are maybe just starting off or have not been doing this for too long feel a bit better, because they're just like, I'm so bad, I've just started and look at this, it's causing all these issues. Hands up if you still get issues with cataphylls on occasion, regardless of how many years you've been dealing with plants, and you should theoretically know better. It still happens. So for the new people out there that are just starting and they're watching this, there is hope, don't worry. Even we have issues with cataphylls. But it's just being able to kind of recognize it for the positive that it is, and also be able to recognize if there's any issues there that you need to keep your eyes on. But yes, Hopefully you've enjoyed, hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, bye.